German Shepherd K9 reunites with his rescuer. What he does next leaves everyone in tears. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension and hushed whispers, as Detective Jack Lawson sat at the defendant's table. His hands were clasped tightly together, his usual confident demeanor replaced with a hardened gaze, his jaw set in quiet defiance. Across the room, the prosecutor, Daniel Reed, adjusted his tie, a barely concealed smirk on his face as he shuffled through his stack of evidence. The case had been plastered across newspapers and television screens for weeks. Detective Jack Lawson, once hailed as one of the city's finest, was now accused of corruption, charged with abusing his power during a high-profile drug raid. Jack's heart pounded as he listened to the opening statements. Reed wasted no time painting him as a disgraced officer who had betrayed the badge, accusing him of planting evidence and accepting bribes from the very criminals he was sworn to apprehend. The jury, a mix of stern and skeptical faces, listened intently, their eyes darting between Reed and Jack as the accusations piled up. Jack clenched his fists beneath the table. He knew he had been set up. The drug bust had been legitimate, a months-long operation that led to one of the biggest seizures in city history. Yet somehow, the evidence had been manipulated, twisted into a narrative that cast him as the villain. His gut told him this was more than just a simple framed job. There was something deeper, something far more sinister at play, but without proof, all he had was his word against theirs. His defense attorney, Laura Mitchell, a sharp-witted lawyer with a reputation for dismantling false narratives, stood up with an air of confidence that momentarily quieted the murmurs in the room. She methodically began tearing apart Reed's argument, questioning the reliability of the witnesses who had come forward against Jack. Most of them were criminals with histories of deceit, men who had every reason to want Jack out of the picture. Detective Lawson has spent over a decade putting criminals behind bars. Are we really to believe that a man with an unblemished record suddenly decided to compromise his entire career for a quick payday? Laura's voice rang out, firm and clear. Or is it more likely that someone with much to lose orchestrated this to save their own skin? A ripple of unease spread across the room. The judge, an older man with piercing eyes, tapped his gavel lightly, signaling for order. But despite Laura's skillful arguments, the evidence presented against Jack was damning. Fabricated reports, altered footage, bank transactions in his name that he had never seen before. It was a well-planned trap, and he had walked right into it. Jack kept his expression unreadable, but beneath the surface, he felt the slow burn of frustration. He glanced briefly toward the back of the courtroom where a familiar pair of dark brown eyes met his. Rex, his loyal K9 partner, sat obediently under the watch of an officer. The German Shepherd's ears twitched, his gaze locked onto Jack as if sensing the turmoil in his handler. Rex had been there during the raid, had smelled the fear of the criminals, had known something wasn't right even before Jack had. The thought struck him, Rex had been trained to detect danger, deceit, and aggression. What if his instincts could be used in his defense? It was an unconventional move, but Jack knew that if there was anyone in that room who could separate truth from lies, it was his partner. As the prosecution continued its attack, Laura turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, I would like to request an extraordinary witness," she said, drawing curious glances from the jury and spectators. "Detective Lawson's K9 partner, Rex." The room erupted into murmurs, even a few scoffs from the prosecution side. "A dog?" Reed sneered, feigning amusement. "Is that your key witness, Ms. Mitchell? Should we have him take the oath as well?" Laughter scattered through the courtroom, but Laura remained unfazed. "This isn't a joke, Mr. Reed," she countered. "Rex is a highly trained police K9. He can sense deception, he can track criminals, and he has been an integral part of this investigation. If there is anyone in this room who can tell us who the real culprit is, it's him." The judge adjusted his glasses, his expression unreadable. After a long pause, he finally nodded. "I will allow it," he said, to the visible irritation of Reed. "But proceed carefully, Ms. Mitchell. This is highly irregular." Jack let out a slow breath as the officer leading Rex forward removed the leash, allowing the German Shepherd to move freely in the room. The moment Rex was released, he trotted directly to Jack, sitting by his side, his tail still, his posture rigid and alert. Then, slowly, his head turned toward the prosecution's table. The moment Rex's eyes locked onto Reed, the dog's hackles bristled. A low, deep growl rumbled from his chest. The room fell silent. Reed stiffened, his fingers twitching over his stack of papers. "Control your dog," he snapped, but his voice lacked the same smugness it had held earlier.
Jack said nothing.
He simply placed a hand on Rex's back, feeling the tension in the dog's muscles. He had seen Rex react like this before on the field, when they had been closing in on a suspect, when the air was thick with danger. Rex wasn't just reacting to noise or commotion. He was reacting to something far more instinctual. Laura turned toward the jury, her voice calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a police-trained dog who has worked alongside Detective Lawson for years. He has tracked murderers, sniffed out narcotics, and put criminals behind bars. And right now, he is telling you something is wrong." The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Reed shifted in his seat, his smirk long gone. Jack caught the flicker of unease in his expression, the subtle shift in his posture. Something was happening, something was unraveling right before their eyes, and Rex was at the center of it. The courtroom's air grew suffocating, thick with uncertainty, as all eyes remained fixated on Rex, who stood rigid beside Jack. The low, guttural growl that rumbled from the German shepherd's chest was unlike anything the courtroom had ever witnessed before. And for the first time since the trial had begun, Reed's confidence faltered. His fingers twitched over his papers, his breath coming just a little quicker. The once smug smirk on his lips had now been replaced by something else, uncertainty, or perhaps even fear. Jack, who had spent years alongside Rex in high-stress situations, knew exactly what his partner's body language meant. This wasn't just an ordinary reaction to a crowded room or raised voices. Rex had sensed something. Something was off, and Jack could feel the weight of it pressing down on him like an impending storm. Laura took a slow step forward, her heels clicking against the polished wood floor. Her gaze locked onto Reed. "Mr. Reed, would you care to explain why a highly trained police K9, one with years of service in detecting deception and criminal activity, is reacting so aggressively toward you?" Her voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy silence like a blade. The jury members exchanged glances, shifting in their seats, clearly unsettled by the sight of the normally composed prosecutor looking shaken. Reed let out a forced chuckle, though it lacked any real amusement. "This is absurd," he scoffed, adjusting his tie with a quick, nervous motion. "Are we really standing here trying to interpret the thoughts of a dog? This is a courtroom, Ms. Mitchell, not some circus act." Laura folded her arms, her lips curling slightly in what could only be described as satisfaction. "And yet you seem rather uncomfortable," she gestured toward Rex, who had now taken a step closer to the prosecution's table, his eyes never leaving Reed. "Perhaps you'd like to explain why that is." The question lingered in the air, unanswered. Jack watched as Reed swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He was trying to maintain composure, but the cracks were starting to show. Jack had seen this before. Criminals, when backed into a corner, often tried to act nonchalant, but the telltale signs of distress always surfaced: a twitch of the fingers, a bead of sweat, a slight shift in breathing. And now the prosecutor, the man who had orchestrated this entire case against him, was displaying those very signs. "Enough of this nonsense." Reed snapped, his voice a little too sharp, a little too defensive. "We are here to discuss Detective Lawson's crimes, not the paranoid delusions of a mutt." But the moment the word left his lips, the growl from Rex deepened. In an instant, the dog took another step forward, muscles tensing as though preparing to launch. A sharp gasp echoed through the courtroom as a few spectators instinctively flinched back. Jack reached down, placing a firm hand on Rex's back, feeling the vibrations of his growl beneath his palm. "Easy, boy," he murmured under his breath, though his mind was racing. Rex had worked countless cases with him, had detected criminals in hiding, had sniffed out deception like it was second nature. If Rex was reacting this way to Reed, it meant only one thing: the prosecutor was hiding something. And not just anything. Something big. Judge Holloway cleared his throat, his normally impassive face showing the slightest trace of curiosity. "Ms. Mitchell, while I will allow this to continue for now, I would advise you to make your point quickly. This is highly unorthodox." Laura nodded, unfazed. "Understood, Your Honor." She turned back to Reed, her gaze as sharp as ever. Mr. Reed, if you are as innocent as you claim to be, then surely you wouldn't mind answering a few more questions regarding your involvement in the raid that led to my client's arrest. Reed stiffened, but before he could respond, Laura lifted a single document from her file and held it up for the jury to see. This, she continued, her voice steady, is a record of all officers and legal personnel who were involved in handling the evidence from that night. What's interesting, Mr. Reed, is that your name appears here multiple times. In fact, it seems you had direct access to the very evidence that was later used to frame Detective Lawson. A murmur spread through the courtroom, the energy in the room shifting dramatically.
Jack's pulse quickened.
He hadn't seen this document before. Had Laura been holding on to it, waiting for the right moment? Or had she just found the chink in Reed's armor? Reed forced out another laugh, though this time it came out brittle and weak. Of course, my name is there, he said quickly. I'm the lead prosecutor. It's my job to review case files, to examine evidence.
This proves nothing.
Laura smiled. That's true. But what doesn't make sense is why the chain of custody report lists you as the last person to handle a piece of evidence that later went missing.
The murmurs grew louder.
Jack could see the shift in the jury now. Their initial skepticism toward him was starting to fade, replaced with something new, doubt. Doubt toward the man who had so confidently accused him. Reed's face turned a shade paler. He started, but before he could finish, Rex let out a sudden, sharp bark, causing everyone to flinch. It wasn't just a random noise. It was a signal. A declaration. Jack knew that bark. He had heard it countless times in the field, right before Rex took down a suspect. It meant one thing: Rex had identified a threat.
Reed's breath hitched.
His fingers clenched against the table, his body language screaming unease. Jack narrowed his eyes. Rex never makes mistakes, he said, his voice low but firm. So tell me, Reed, why is he looking at you like you're the real criminal here? The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it again. His composure, once so unwavering, was slipping fast. He knew he was losing control of the narrative. And the more Rex growled, the more the courtroom leaned into the tension, watching, waiting. The judge banged his gavel. Order, he demanded. Ms. Mitchell, where are you going with this? Laura exhaled, then turned back to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, we are here today because my client, Detective Jack Lawson, has been accused of corruption. Yet, right in front of us, we have a highly trained police K-9 signaling that the man making these accusations may not be telling the truth. We have a prosecutor who has handled evidence that conveniently went missing. And we have inconsistencies in the case that are beginning to form a very clear picture. Detective Lawson was set up. Silence. Then, a sudden, sharp movement. Reed stood up, gathering his papers with shaking hands. This is ridiculous, he muttered, his voice barely audible. I don't have to sit here and listen to this circus act. But as he turned to leave, Rex barked again. Louder. More forceful. A warning. A demand for truth. And in that moment, as all eyes turned to the rattled prosecutor, Jack knew they had him. Reed froze mid-step, his grip tightening around the stack of papers in his hand as though they were a shield against the growing scrutiny. The courtroom had become a pressure cooker of silence, heavy and oppressive. Every eye locked onto the prosecutor who had, until this moment, wielded his authority with unwavering confidence. But now, that confidence was cracking, piece by piece, under the weight of the accusations, under the eyes of the jury, under the unrelenting gaze of Rex. The German shepherd stood firm beside Jack, his posture tense, his ears perked forward in keen awareness. Jack didn't move. Didn't speak. His instincts told him that the unraveling of the truth was now set in motion. And all he had to do was wait for Reed to make a mistake. Laura, sharp as ever, stepped toward the witness stand, flipping through her documents with deliberate slowness, letting the silence stretch just enough to let Reed's discomfort fester. Mr. Reed, she finally said, her tone deceptively calm, you seem awfully eager to leave. But we're not done here. In fact, I think we're just getting started. She lifted another sheet of paper and adjusted her glasses.
Let's talk about the missing evidence, shall we?
Reed's head snapped toward her, his expression darkening. I already told you, he said, his voice a little too tight. Prosecutors review evidence all the time. It's part of the process. Laura didn't even blink. That's true. But what's not part of the process is signing off on the movement of key evidence, and then having that evidence disappear before it could be analyzed by an independent investigator. She turned toward the jury, holding up the document. Here we have a chain of custody report. And it's quite interesting. It shows that a piece of crucial evidence, a ledger containing the names of cartel members involved in the raid, was logged out under your authorization. However, according to department records, it was never returned.
A visible ripple of murmurs spread through the jury and the gallery.
The judge lifted an eyebrow, but he did not interrupt. The walls were closing in on Reed, and everyone could see it. Reed opened his mouth, then closed it again. His nostrils flared as he tried to compose himself. That ledger, he said, voice strained, was misplaced. The department handles thousands of pieces of evidence every year. It's not unusual for something to get lost in the shuffle. Laura tilted her head, feigning curiosity. Misplaced, she repeated. That's odd, because we recently received a copy of the department's internal investigation into the missing ledger.
And guess what, Mr. Reed?
That investigation determined that the last recorded location of the ledger was in your office.
In your possession.
3 days before you filed charges against my client. She turned the paper to face him, though she knew he didn't need to read it. He already knew what it said. Would you care to explain that? Reed's jaw twitched. He had nowhere to run.
No easy way out.
Jack watched him closely, his pulse steady despite the adrenaline humming beneath his skin. He had been in enough interrogations to recognize the signs of a man on the verge of breaking. The courtroom was dead silent again, save for the quiet panting of Rex, who hadn't taken his eyes off Reed. Jack could feel the tension rolling off his partner in waves. Rex knew. He could smell the truth. In the sweat beading at Reed's temples. In the shallow hitch of his breath. I don't recall, Reed finally said, his voice hoarse. Laura let out a small chuckle. You don't recall, she echoed. You don't recall signing for a crucial piece of evidence in one of the city's biggest drug busts? You don't recall it being in your office? And you don't recall how it just vanished right before it could be examined? Reed's hand clenched into a fist. That's not what I meant. Oh, I think it's exactly what you meant, Laura pressed. She turned back to the jury, walking slowly across the courtroom as she spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to ask yourself something. Why would a prosecutor whose job is to uphold justice conveniently forget about evidence that could have cleared? My client's name. Why would a police K-9 trained to detect lies, trained to uncover criminal intent, and react so aggressively toward Mr. Reed? She stopped at the jury box, letting her words settle. Isn't it obvious? Reed slammed his hands on the table. Enough! He barked, his composure snapping like a frayed wire. The outburst sent a jolt through the room. Even the judge straightened in his chair. Jack watched, fascinated, as the man who had been so meticulous, so calculating, now stood on the precipice of his own undoing. He had seen it before in interrogation rooms, when the guilty realized they were cornered, when the pressure became too much, when they felt the walls closing in. Laura, sensing that she had pushed him to the edge, took a single step forward. Her voice was quieter now, but sharper than ever. What did you do, Reed? She asked. Reed's face was ghostly pale, his breaths coming quick and shallow. His fingers twitched, and for a moment, Jack thought he might bolt. He tried to escape the very room he had commanded just moments ago. But then something else happened, something that sent the entire courtroom into a spiral. Rex moved in a flash. The German shepherd surged forward, his growl turning into a full-fledged snarl as he lunged toward Reed. Jack barely had time to react. His reflexes kicked in as he reached for Rex's collar, pulling him back just enough to stop him from making contact. But the damage had already been done. Reed flinched so violently that he stumbled back, knocking over his chair. His eyes were wide with sheer panic. Then, in his haste to scramble away from the dog, something slipped from his grasp. A folded piece of paper fluttered to the floor like a fallen leaf. Laura's eyes snapped to it instantly. So did Jack's. Reed scrambled to grab it, but Laura was faster. She lunged forward, snatching the paper before he could get his fingers around it. The moment she opened it, her expression shifted into something cold, something lethal. Jack stood, his heart pounding. "What is it?" he asked. Laura looked up, her eyes locking onto his. "Proof."
The single word sent an electric shock through the room.
Reed's breath hitched, his pants palpable. "That's nothing," he stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. Laura shook her head, her smile one of triumph. "This," she said, holding up the paper, "is a written confirmation of a payment. A large sum of money wired to an offshore account." She turned back to the jury. "And guess who it was signed by?"
Silence.
Then, Daniel Reed. The reaction was instant. The courtroom exploded into chaos, voices overlapping, gasps of shock filling the space.
The pieces of the puzzle clicked together.
As Jack looked down at Rex, watching the way his partner stood tall, ears forward, eyes locked on the man who had tried to destroy them, he knew the truth was finally out. They had won. The courtroom was in chaos, voices rising in shock and disbelief as the weight of the revelation settled over everyone like a storm cloud ready to burst. Jack remained still, his pulse hammering against his ribs as he watched Reed stagger back, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him. The prosecutor's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out, only the ragged sound of his panicked breathing. His hands twitched at his sides, fingers curling into fists as though he could physically grasp the authority that was now slipping from his grasp. The judge banged his gavel furiously, demanding order, but the courtroom had already spiraled into a maelstrom of murmurs and shouts, a whirlwind of shifting allegiances and shattered perceptions. Jack barely heard any of it. His focus was entirely on Rex, whose stance remained unshaken, muscles taut, eyes locked onto Reed as though the dog could see straight through to whatever twisted darkness lay beneath his polished exterior. Rex had never wavered, had never doubted what Jack had known in his gut all along. Reed was corrupt. And now, with the proof in Laura's hands, the world finally knew it too. Reed lurched forward, his voice cracking as he tried to snatch the damning document from Laura's grasp. But she sidestepped him with ease, holding the paper high. "Your Honor," she called out over the commotion, her voice steady and unwavering. "This document is irrefutable evidence that the prosecution's case against Detective Lawson was built on lies. This payment, traced to an offshore account, proves Daniel Reed was financially compensated to manipulate the evidence in this case and ensure my client took the fall for crimes he never committed." The jury's expressions shifted from skepticism to grim understanding. Some sat frozen, while others whispered among themselves. Their eyes darted between Jack and Reed as the reality of the situation sank in. Reed's face had gone stark white, a sheen of sweat glistening at his temples. He pointed a trembling finger at Laura. "That paper doesn't prove anything," he choked out, but his voice lacked conviction. "This is a setup, fabricated, this is." Jack finally stood, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade.
"You're done, Reed."
The simple statement held no malice, no satisfaction, just the finality of truth. Reed took a step back, eyes darting toward the exit, his breaths shallow and erratic. The realization dawned on Jack in an instant. Reed wasn't going to stay and face this. He was going to run. The shift in his posture, the way his gaze flicked to the doors, the tension in his legs as if preparing to bolt, it was all there, as clear as day. And Jack wasn't the only one who noticed. Rex's growl deepened. Reed moved. It happened so fast that, for a moment, time seemed to stretch, every second thick with tension. One moment, Reed was standing behind his desk, and the next, he was lunging toward the door, his panic overriding whatever scrap of rational thought he had left. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had underestimated Rex. The German shepherd launched forward, his powerful body a blur of motion as he surged toward the fleeing prosecutor. Reed barely made it 3 steps before Rex intercepted him, his teeth sinking into the fabric of the man's expensive suit, dragging him to the ground with a force that sent papers scattering across the floor. Reed let out a strangled yelp as he crashed down, his arms flailing as he tried in vain to push the dog away. But Rex held firm, pinning him with a growl that sent a fresh wave of silence through the courtroom. Jack moved swiftly, stepping forward just as the BFFs rushed in, weapons drawn. Their commands rang out over the stunned murmurs of the crowd.
"Stand down, Rex,"
Jack ordered, his voice commanding, authoritative. The dog hesitated only for a fraction of a second before releasing his grip, stepping back but remaining poised, muscles still tight with vigilance as the officers hauled Reed up, gripping his arms in an iron hold. Reed's face was red with rage and humiliation, his chest rising and falling in rapid, uneven breaths. "You can't do this," he spat, his voice raw with desperation.
"You have nothing."
"Nothing."
Laura held up the paper again.
"We have enough," she corrected smoothly, her expression unreadable. The judge, who had remained silent through the chaos, finally straightened in his seat.
His expression darkened.
His gavel struck down with finality. "BFFs, take Mr. Reed into custody. An investigation will be launched immediately into these new findings." His sharp gaze shifted toward Jack, the weight of his scrutiny pressing down for a long, lingering moment before he nodded. "As for the charges against Detective Lawson, they are officially dropped." A wave of noise erupted in the room again, but this time it was different. Where before there had been doubt and hostility, now there was applause, hushed words of astonishment, the collective realization that justice had just shifted in an entirely unexpected direction. Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he had been holding. His muscles finally eased after what felt like an eternity of tension. Rex, still at his side, let out a quiet huff, his tail giving a single contented wag. Jack reached down, running a hand over the dog's thick fur, his fingers lingering as he absorbed the reality of what had just transpired. He had been so close to losing everything, his career, his reputation, his freedom. And yet, against all odds, the truth had found a way to surface, carried not just by evidence, but by the unwavering instincts of the partner who had never once let him down. As the BFFs escorted a now visibly shaken Reed from the courtroom, Jack turned to Laura, who was watching him with the slightest hint of a smirk. "I have to admit," she said, crossing her arms, "I've had some unconventional witnesses before, but this one might be my favorite." Jack let out a breath of laughter, shaking his head as he glanced down at Rex. "He always knows," he murmured. "Even before I do." Laura's gaze softened. "Well, it's a good thing he does," she said, "because I don't think we would have gotten here without him." Jack looked back at Rex, the weight of gratitude settling in his chest. He reached down, scratching behind the dog's ears, his voice quieter now.
"I owe you, buddy."
Rex simply licked his hand in response. As the spectators began to filter out of the courtroom, the energy in the room shifted from turmoil to relief. Jack straightened, rolling his shoulders as if shedding the weight of the past weeks. He had fought against a system that had turned on him, against corruption that had tried to silence him. And he had won. Not because of politics. Not because of luck. But because of truth.
Because of Rex.
And as he walked out of the courtroom, his partner trotting beside him, Jack knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, they would face it together.
The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the steps of the courthouse as Jack stepped outside.
The crisp air filled his lungs with a relief so sharp it almost hurt. The weight of the past weeks, the endless accusations, the doubt that had clung to him like a second skin, was finally gone. He could feel it unraveling, dissipating with each breath, each step forward. Rex walked beside him, his ears perked, his stride confident, as if he, too, understood the victory they had just claimed. The loyal German shepherd had never faltered, had never questioned Jack's innocence. And now, as they moved past the gathering crowd, the murmurs of the onlookers shifted from suspicion to admiration. Jack knew that none of this would have been possible without him. Laura caught up to him at the base of the steps, slipping her sunglasses on as she shook her head in disbelief. "Well, Detective, I have to say, of all the cases I've worked on, this one might just be the most satisfying." Her smirk was laced with triumph, but beneath it was something else.
Something softer.
"I knew we had a shot, but I didn't expect Reed to break that fast." Jack exhaled, rubbing a hand across his jaw as he let his gaze drift across the bustling street. He knew he was done the moment Rex reacted to him, he admitted. A guy like that, a man used to control, doesn't handle being exposed well. He thought he had this whole thing locked down, but the second that dog looked at him like a suspect, his body betrayed him. He glanced down at Rex, who sat attentively at his side, tongue slightly hanging out, completely unfazed by the storm they had just walked through. Jack smirked. Turns out even criminals in expensive suits can't lie to a dog. Laura chuckled, folding her arms. Well, he's not just any dog. He's the reason you're walking out of here a free man. Her voice lowered just slightly, losing its teasing edge. And I have a feeling he's the reason you're still standing at all. Jack didn't respond right away. Instead, he crouched beside Rex, running a hand through the thick fur along his back. The German shepherd nudged his hand in response, his eyes bright, waiting for whatever came next.
"You saved me, partner," Jack murmured.
And even though the words were quiet, they carried a weight far heavier than anything that had been said in that courtroom. Rex's tail gave a small wag, as if to acknowledge the truth of it. Laura sighed, shifting her weight as she glanced toward the street.
"So what now? You getting your badge back?"
Jack straightened, rolling his shoulders as he considered it. The department had already reached out before the trial had even ended. Their sudden change of heart was predictable now that the truth had come to light. They wanted him back. Wanted to smooth over the scandal with a neat little reinstatement.
A press conference.
Maybe even a medal to make up for the hell they had put him through. But as Jack looked out over the city, the same city he had spent years protecting, he felt something settle inside him.
Something certain.
"No," he said finally, shaking his head. "I think I'm done." Laura raised an eyebrow. "Really?
After everything?"
Jack glanced at her, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I didn't become a cop for politics. I did it because I wanted to do the right thing. To serve. To make a difference. But after this..." He exhaled sharply. "The system chewed me up the second it was convenient. If it weren't for Rex, I'd be rotting in a cell right now."
"I can't go back to that. Pretending like nothing happened."
Laura studied him for a long moment before nodding. "So what then?"
"Private security? Consulting?"
Jack considered it, his gaze drifting down to Rex, who was watching him patiently, always waiting for his next command. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But whatever it is, it'll be on my own terms." He reached down, scratching behind the dog's ear, earning another contented wag of his tail. "And wherever I go, he goes too." Laura smiled. "Well, I can't argue with that." She hesitated, then added, "You know, if you ever decide to take your skills into the private sector, I might have a few connections. Just saying." Jack chuckled. "Noted." A sudden burst of movement drew their attention, and Jack turned to see a familiar figure weaving through the thinning crowd. It took him a second to place the man. Then recognition clicked into place.
Captain Harris.
His former superior. The one who had watched him get thrown to the wolves without so much as lifting a finger. Jack's expression hardened instinctively. Harris stopped a few feet away, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "Lawson," he greeted, his tone unreadable. Jack didn't respond right away, waiting. Harris sighed, his gaze shifting to Rex before meeting Jack's eyes again. "Look, I won't pretend like the department handled this well. We didn't." He exhaled heavily, shifting his weight. "But I'm here to say that I was wrong. A lot of us were. And I won't insult you by asking you to come back. I just wanted you to hear it from me." Jack studied him, searching for any sign of insincerity. But all he found was exhaustion. Maybe even regret. He nodded once. "Appreciated." Harris gave him a long look, then nodded back before turning and disappearing into the crowd.
Jack let out a slow breath.
Maybe it wasn't the apology he deserved. But it was something. And right now, that was enough. Rex let out a small bark, drawing Jack's attention back to him. The German shepherd was standing now, his tail swishing lazily, his eyes expectant. Jack chuckled.
Yeah, I know. Let's get out of here." Laura shook her head in amusement.
"Well, Wherever you end up, try not to get yourself into another massive conspiracy, will you?" Jack smirked.
"No promises."
As he turned and walked away from the courthouse, Rex trotting faithfully at his side, Jack felt something he hadn't in a long time. Freedom. Not just from the charges. Not just from the trial. But from the weight of everything that had held him down for years. He didn't know what came next. Didn't know what the future held. But what he did know was this: whatever it was, he wasn't facing it alone. And that, more than anything, was enough.